afternoon to all of you. My name is Olgun Akbulut. I'm a human rights and constitutional scholar based here in Istanbul. I'll be the moderator for today's webinar. On behalf of the Human Rights Academy or the Frederick Naumann Foundation Turkey, I would like to issue a warm welcome to all of you for joining us for today's webinar on COVID-19 and human rights. The pandemic have affected our lives in a way that a range of human rights issues came up for discussion. So general lockdown measures we experienced, and it limited our freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, and freedom of worship in public. So some had health issues, which indicates a demand for the right to health. Trials were postponed, that reminds us fair trial rights. And due to newly established tracking systems in some countries, people feel their right to privacy might be in danger. And some states declared state of emergency, and consequently, they derogated from their international human rights obligations. In some other countries, opposition criticizing the official data about COVID-19 came under attack. In some countries, they are harassed. In some places, they are even detained. And in some countries, interestingly, they disappeared against their will. So, like in all public crises, women, children, refugees, and minorities are perhaps the ones affected the most. So we have a lot of issues to discuss, but I'm going to stop here and invite our distinguished speaker, Professor Rick Lawson. Rick is a good friend of FNF-Turkey. He's a professor of human rights, EU and international law at Leiden Law School in the Netherlands. We hosted him here in Istanbul almost a year ago. He talked to us on judicial independence from a human rights perspective. COVID-19 kept us apart physically for a while, but technology helped us to hold this webinar. So we are very grateful that he accepted our webinar invitation for today. I'm not going to go into details of Rick's long list of achievements in academia. We are at an online platform and his academic works are just a click away. And those of you who have had a mistake of not yet being familiar with Rick's scholarship, you will definitely Google him after the event. I'm pretty much sure about that. And a short note about the program today. Professor Lawson will have around 40 minutes to present his initial thoughts. Then we look forward to continuing the discussion with the members of the audience for another 40 minutes. And now I will leave the Zoom platform to Rick. So Rick, over to you.
Thank you, Olgun. Merhaba. This is about the only Turkish word I know, but it's very dear to me. Good afternoon. My name is Rick Lawson from Leiden University in the Netherlands. It is a great pleasure to be with you, not physically, but at least thanks to the miracles of the internet. I hope that you can hear me and see me, and that today we can have a discussion, a dialogue on the interaction between the pandemic, the corona crisis that we have all been undergoing, and human rights. I'm very grateful to my friend and colleague, Professor Akbulut from Kadir for inviting me. I realize he could have invited many other colleagues from academia or from practice, but he thought of me, and I'm very grateful for that and for his generous introduction. I'm also grateful for the foundation, Friedrich Neumann Stiftung, which cooperates very well with Kadir Law School and has many interesting projects in Turkey. And I would certainly recommend you, if you haven't done so, to visit the website of the foundation. I have a PowerPoint presentation, which I will share with you. Greetings from Leiden to Istanbul. Our two universities connected through the internet, but of course, very far apart. I don't know whether all participants can actually see the entire screen. For me, part of the right side of the screen is blocked by my own face and by Professor Akbulut's face. But there is somewhere a map of Europe locating Turkey, showing that our two countries are on the opposite sides of the continent, the northwest in my case, and the southeast in the case of my moderator and many participants. Why do I stress this issue of geography? Because I think location matters. If you talk about the corona crisis, about COVID-19, it does make a difference where you are. These are some statistics about my own country, ones that I think are maybe the best and most reliable indicators of how serious a crisis is. Statistics are, of course, always difficult. You cannot always trust them. Are they entirely reliable? But what to me is a reliable indicator is how many people have been admitted to intensive care in the hospitals, because then we know that they're in a very serious situation and they are recorded by the official hospital. So we know a bit about the severity of the crisis. And what you can see in both graphs, the first graph is the number of patients who were admitted to the intensive care. And the second graph below is the total amount of patients who were in intensive care. And clearly you can see that we had a rough time by the end of March and early April. And then from the end of April on, it started to decline. And in a way, we have the feeling that we have had, for the time being at least, no one can predict the future, but for the time being at least, we have had the worst behind us. Here's another graph. This is an estimation of the number of persons in our country who are contagious, so who could pass on the disease to others. And as you can see, according to the official estimations from the official Dutch Government Institute, the number of people is quite close to nil. So actually, in my country, we believe, for the right or the wrong reasons, I don't know, we believe that we're sort of safe. So inevitably what happens is that people take a breath, they relax, they go out, they have a drink on the terraces, the shops reopen, and fewer measures are taken. Of course, we're still being scared and cautious. As I told my friend, I was in Paris this weekend and I could see there were very few tourists. So life is not completely back to normal. But in a way, if we talk in this part of Europe about the corona crisis, it has a sense to it of looking back to what happened, and we are in a sort of evaluation mode and maybe trying to prepare for a possible second wave. Now we realize that this is very different in other parts of the world. If in Europe, the worst part of the corona crisis was in the second half of March and in April, it gradually diminished by and large. And you can see from this graph, which is from the World Health Organization, that especially in the Americas and in the southeast of Asia, the crisis is really very bad. The numbers are on the rise. And on this map, you can see countries that are severely affected. Again, these are World Health Organization figures. And what you can see is the dark countries report many new cases. Of course, all this is dependent on reporting. If large parts of Africa report low numbers, it may well be because testing there is very limited or statistics are not really being collected. If no data are available about Mongolia, who knows what the reason is, but you can see that at least the United States, Brazil, and India are now the countries which are worst affected by the crisis. And as we speak, thousands and thousands of new patients are being recorded. So it really matters where you are on this globe and the extent to which the measures have or where the disease, the pandemic has an impact. There's also another way in which location matters. There is a very interesting website which is run by the University of Oxford, the Coronavirus Government Response Tracker, and it indicates how stringent, how severe the measures are that are being taken across the globe. And it's quite an interesting website. It can easily be found on the internet, and you can see from day to day how stringent government measures are. The University of Oxford has a number of indicators, like is there a lockdown, are shops closed, are meetings prohibited or not? And the bluer a country is, the more stringent the measures are. And over time, you can see changes. You can see how in mid-March, when the crisis started in full in Europe, Italy was already taking strong measures, some Central European countries as well, Spain as well, China, of course, where the crisis originated, but many other countries were in a sort of low and relaxed mode, and then they changed. If you compare it to July 2014, then clearly the crisis isn't over yet. So the impact both of the pandemic, the virus itself, and of government responses varies greatly from place to place and time to time. There's also another way in which location matters. Some countries are in a position to buy medicine. We heard about a month ago that the United States had bought the entire world stock of a drug that was believed to be helpful in fighting the disease. Those who are caught by corona could be helped by this remdesivir drug, and the United States, wishing to protect its own population, bought all the stocks for the next 3 or 4 months. That was the United States, but a couple of weeks later, 4 European countries, France, Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands, signed a vaccine deal with a company based in the UK, buying lots of vaccines, indicating that they would be willing to share this with other European states that were willing to sign in to the deal. But it does give you an impression that some countries are financially in a position to buy drugs or to buy vaccines which may not be available for other countries. So also in that respect, locations do make a difference. And if we talk about human rights and equal rights for all, then of course it will be highly interesting, very interesting to see how a vaccine will be distributed over the world once it is available in existence. Location matters, and there's also another reason why location matters. Just 2 weeks ago, the European Union announced, after lengthy discussions, that certain travel restrictions would be lifted for residents from third countries, those who want to travel to the European Union. Already a footnote here, the European Union will return time and again in my story. Although it's not a human rights organization, it does play a role in my story today. I will get back to this later on. The Council, bringing together the ministers of the governments of the EU member states, after negotiations, adopted a recommendation, as it is officially called, for the gradual lifting of the temporary restrictions on non-essential travel into the EU. And then you see a number of countries, about 15 of them, who are considered to be safe, and travel restrictions at the external borders are lifted for people coming from these countries. And it is interesting, location matters, because who is not welcome, who is not on the list? And now you may check whether your own country happens to be on this list of 15, but what I find so interesting is we do not have the United States, we do not have Brazil, and we do not have the third flag, Belarus. And what do these countries have in common? There are many differences, of course, but each one of them has a leader which has been downplaying the risk of the coronavirus. President Trump, it's sometimes a bit difficult to follow his course, but for weeks he has been downplaying the coronavirus as a flu that would pass by, and he insisted that life should go on as normal so that the economy wouldn't suffer. Likewise, Mr. Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, said that the coronavirus is just a little flu. I think he's in the process of experiencing whether this is actually accurate or not. And then we have Mr. Lukashenko, the boss of Belarus, who did not want to take any measures at all. And he said, we are a strong country and we can handle this little virus. In each of these countries, for a long time, the situation was underestimated. No measures were taken, unlike in several Central and East European countries. And we now see that the pandemic is spreading in these countries, that the governments lost precious time in taking necessary measures. It is interesting to reflect on leadership styles and what Corona teaches us. For me, if there is any single lesson that so far the Corona crisis has taught me, it is the importance of free speech. What you see here, and I'm not going to read it out aloud, I think that the foundation will be able to make my PowerPoint presentation available after the event, so that if participants want to go through it and read it at their leisure, they can do so. But what I have here is an article in The Guardian, a British newspaper, about the origins of the corona crisis. And there is this story, you must have heard the story many times, about the Chinese doctor Li Wenliang, who at a very early stage suspected that there was something going on in the city of Wuhan. He came across people who were infected and who did not meet the customary conditions of ordinary flus. He suspected there was something wrong. And when he reported this to the authorities, instead of taking this message seriously and responding to it, they said, you're only trying to raise alarm, you're spreading false rumors, you're disrupting social order, keep quiet. And so he was forced to shut up, to be silent, as a result of which many weeks passed in which the disease perhaps could have been contained. A very sad story indeed, because Dr. Li Wenliang got contaminated himself and died, and I think that he's one of the martyrs of this whole crisis. If China valued free speech, the argument is there would be no coronavirus crisis. And I think one of the messages of the corona crisis is that free speech is such an important tool to inform the authorities of what is going on in societies, what the problems are that need to be addressed, where policies are failing to protect the citizens. And this is, I think, an important message to keep in mind. It is also about how we frame the debate on human rights and the corona crisis or COVID-19. Quite often what you will hear is a narrative like the authorities seek to protect the population. It is better if we are all staying at home, if we keep quiet, if we don't disrupt the policies of the authorities, the population should shut up. And if somebody raises the voice, if somebody exercises the freedom of expression or seeks to organize a demonstration, it is portrayed as a disruption, as a potential danger, as causing instability and uncertainty. We'd rather not have these dissident voices. I think the sad story of Dr. Li Wenliang shows us how wrong this is. I think what the frame ought to be, is that the authorities have a continuous need for information. They should be informed as well as possible, which means that they should open up all the channels of information and should also accept criticism and distant voices, so that together we can hope to achieve the best policies. And indeed, in those countries that have a tradition of transparency, of accountability, where the authorities explain to the public what the policies are, why these policies are taken, which data they are based, and conversely, the citizens are in a position to question certain assumptions, to question policies, to ask for corrections. In those countries, by and large, one would say that the anti-corona measures have been quite productive. And those countries where there were authoritarian leaders who put their head in the sand and didn't want to know that there was a crisis coming up are sometimes lagging behind. So one lesson for me is the importance of free speech, not as an antagonistic notion which is there to bother and hinder the authorities, but rather as a vital tool to keep a society healthy in very literal sense. Another lesson. It was, I think, a sad coincidence, but during the corona crisis, Mr. George Floyd died in the United States as a consequence of police brutality. And I don't need to explain to you what it caused. It triggered a huge movement, Black Lives Matter. And I think this is another lesson that one can derive from the whole COVID-19 situation. If there are social tensions in society, if there are inequalities, if there is a divergence between those who have and those who have not, the rich and the poor, those who have access to health facilities, to health insurance, to nice houses in which one can survive the lockdown in pretty fancy circumstances, or rather be confined to small apartment blocks, all these tensions and inequalities will reach a climax because of the corona crisis. It is a sort of catalyst setting in motion the processes which otherwise would also take place perhaps, but now they speed up. And we have seen, of course, many demonstrations and social inequality causing anger, not just in the United States, but all over the world. According to the New York Times, the Black Lives Matter may now be the largest movement in US history. What may also have played a role is that we were all at home, so we could hear what happened to Mr. George Floyd. We could see the anger rising in the city where he came from, in other American cities. And then I think because the world was turning at a slower pace, more people in more countries picked up this whole movement. So in a way, Corona may also be an engine for social change. And that's a quite interesting observation, I think. Last lesson, before I turn to human rights in a more proper sense, another lesson from the Corona crisis. I think in a way the whole crisis was a wake-up call for existing inequalities, not just social inequalities between races or ethnic minorities, but also working conditions in industries. This is a picture taken from a large German meat producer, huge factory, 6,000 people working there, and they were working there in a very poor conditions, very close to one another, poor hygiene, although this picture suggests otherwise. People really didn't have enough distance from one another and no protective gear, and many people fell ill. And the same is true not just in Germany, but also in various West European countries. And the Corona crisis put the spotlight on the very difficult position that many migrant workers have. They're housed in small apartments where they share bedrooms with many, and as a result, they fell ill. And as a result of this, we are now becoming aware of unacceptable working conditions in many European countries. So we have, I think, quite a bit to talk about when trying to discuss the relationship between COVID-19 and human rights. I asked myself, where should I begin? How could I handle such a big topic in the 40 minutes that I have, of which by now I have already spent maybe 15 or 20 minutes. Where to begin? I thought one way of beginning is to think, what are the core values of human rights? What is it that human rights seek to protect? Maybe we can agree on that and then see to what extent these core values have been protected and secured by our governments, or rather have been under pressure, deliberately or because it was unavoidable. Now, what are core values? I'm sure that Professor Akbulut could write a good book on the core values behind human rights. Here are some core values on which I think we could agree. Human dignity is part of the core values. Freedom, liberty, autonomy, freedom of choice. Equality, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Article 1 of the Universal Declaration. Pluralism, tolerance, broad-mindedness, maybe not in itself a human right, but it's ingrained in the whole notion of human rights that you respect the opinions and expressions of others. And then notions of democracy, the rule of law, the prevention or absence of arbitrariness, which on the one hand are preconditions for human rights protection, on the other hand are very close to human rights, the right to vote, etc. And thinking of that, what about the position of Parliament, of the judiciary, of the free press, of civil society, NGOs, human rights defenders? These are actors in society which constrain the exercise of power, which put limits on those who are in power, constrain their actions, and mitigate what they have in mind, and maybe ensure that we don't get into extreme policies. The link with human rights is sometimes stronger, sometimes not so strong. With the free press and civil society, it's very clear. The freedom of expression, the freedom of association, and the freedom of demonstration, and the right to vote perhaps, and the right to a fair trial, they are linked to these actors. Now, so one way of looking at the relationship between COVID-19 and human rights is to seek how the pandemic affects these core values. But I thought of another approach. I thought, let's look at the various measures that have been taken, that we were confronted with, citizens in Turkey, in India, in the Netherlands. And the first thing that comes to mind, because it affected us all and continues to affect many across the globe and may affect us again in the future, is the lockdown. A notion that has made its entrance into Dutch language. It has become a Dutch word because everybody's talking about lockdown all day. What does a lockdown means in human rights standards? First notion, it affects your freedom of movement. It may even amount to a deprivation of liberty. And if you ask yourself who this guy is, this is Martin Karim. He was one of my students just in the last couple of months. He was an exchange student, bright guy from the Czech Republic. He managed to get home before the lockdown got hold of the Netherlands. He could still travel to his home country, and he went, as so many students did, back to the house of his parents. But there he was, I think it is in the office of his father. It looks a bit like a father's office, and there he had to study, he had to live. Clearly his freedom of movement was affected. And depending on the circumstances, I will get back to this, we may even say that this is a deprivation of liberty. To those who can move, they get used to the mouth cap, something which has been quite common in Asian countries already for several years, less so in my part of the world, but in a way it also affects your freedom to just go as you please and in the way that you please. Then the right to respect for family life. It must have been the same all over the world. In order to protect the older generations, they were subjected to even more stringent restrictions, and they certainly couldn't see their grandchildren, which led to these heartbreaking situations. The little girl is crying because she cannot go to her grandmother. It's a scene from the Netherlands. Maybe it was set in motion because the flowers there do it very nice in the picture, but of course it was not a nice situation, and no doubt many of you have been exposed to the same situation. The freedom of assembly and the freedom of religion. The churches were empty, the mosques were empty. This is on the left side, a picture from Mecca, the Holy Shrine. No visitors this year, quite unlike other years. And no demonstration. These are still demonstrations that took place in the United States, where people were objecting to the lockdown, which they called fascist. They thought it was a tyranny behind lockdown, conspiracy. These are typically Americans, I would think, who don't like to be told what they should be doing. My body, my choice. And you may say that many of these demonstrators are irrational, that they ignore scientific evidence that there is this virus and that it can easily spread from one person to another, and that it makes sense to stay at home. You may criticize them for not seeing that. At the same time, the good thing about these demonstrations is that if things go well, they force the authorities to explain even better the measures they're taking. And if only that is the effect of the demonstrations, more accountability, and that people can express their concerns and their disquiet, that in itself, I think, is a very healthy mechanism in any democracy governed by the rule of law. The right to property, you may not think of it, but of course, all these small shops and restaurants and bars and warehouses that had to close because of the crisis, it meant that the shop owners couldn't use their property as they pleased. They couldn't make a living. Many of them have severe financial problems. It depends again on the location where you are. If the government is in a position to support you, in my country, the support was quite generous. Billions of euros were made available to small and medium-sized enterprises to bridge the period of the lockdown. But in many other countries, this was impossible. And then you can ask yourself, what about the right to property? What about Mr. Elon Musk, who also owns property quite a big one, the Tesla factories, and they said, I'm going to reopen. I don't see why I should close my factory. Now, he's a powerful person. He said to California, where his factory is based, if you don't allow me to resume work, I will replace my factory. I will transfer the factory to another place in the United States. So he's a powerful person who can use his right to property in a forceful way. But of course, he is an exception, and there are many small shops that simply suffer and that cannot enjoy the right to property. The freedom to leave your country and to return to it. There were all these travel restrictions that kept many people stranded. They could not get back to their own country. Health regulations prohibited them from leaving the country. Access to justice. All over the world, courthouses locked down, could not have hearings. People may have been in detention and may not have been brought before a judge to review the legality of their detention simply because the courts were not functioning. And in my country, it is only now that gradually the courts are getting back on their feet and organizing hearings again. So what about access to justice? As you can see, I'm only enumerating rights that are affected by the crisis without having the time to discuss the limitations in all the various countries in great detail. The right to education. Both my colleague, Professor Akbulut, and I, we have been doing our best to continue teaching using the internet and all sorts of modern technologies that we had never heard of before to try and reach our students. But not all universities were in a position to do so. Not all students have the internet connection or the hardware that you need to be online. And then in primary and secondary education, many schools simply closed for months in a row, and thereby limiting, restricting the right to education. Domestic violence, one that you may not think of, but for many people to be locked up in house with perhaps a violent husband was the hell on earth. All statistics show that domestic violence, child abuse, neglect of children, and then more in general, the difficult fate of people who are in a vulnerable position really deteriorated over the last couple of months. So many problematic issues closely connected to the lockdown. And then we should also talk about elections, which should be free and fair. We just had presidential elections over the weekend in Poland. The opposition was complaining that Mr. Duda, who you can see here, could freely campaign because he was the president. He was on the news on a daily basis, whereas candidates of the opposition were not visible at all and couldn't really campaign. If under these circumstances, Mr. Duda manages to get only 50.2 or 50.3% of the votes, I think it's a very poor achievement on his part, because in no way were the weeks and months preceding to the elections even-handed and fair. Talking about elections, this is Serbia, where parliamentary elections took place as well, and where the ruling party of the prime minister was elected again into power. Since then, strong protests in Serbia. Interesting to follow this country. What is being said in the media is that people object against the corona policies of the government, and it seems that they are a bit like these American demonstrators who don't believe that there is a virus. But actually, the reality in Serbia is a little bit different and very interesting to follow. In the weeks prior to the elections, the ruling party, which has won these elections, had relaxed many measures. Football matches could take place, a big tennis match could take place, people could go back to the restaurants, etc. And the government argued that this was possible because their anti-corona measures had been very successful and the number of cases had dropped dramatically. After the elections, which the ruling party had won, it became clear that these statistics were falsified and that many corona cases were not reported to the public, thereby creating the space for the government to pretend that the situation was safe, that nice things for the people could be arranged for, and that the elections could go ahead. And I think that people feel cheated, and understandably so, and this is what is behind the protests in Serbia. It will be an interesting country to follow in the coming weeks, I think. Now, all this was related to the lockdown. Then there is, as was mentioned in the introduction of new techniques allowing for tracking and tracing and testing and treating, which raises all sorts of privacy concerns. What if testing is compulsory? What if apps are installed on your mobile phone which follow you and record with whom you have been in touch? In my country, we've had serious discussions about apps that were proposed by the government, but where privacy experts said that they weren't safe for privacy at all. So there are separate issues there. And then finally, let's not forget, it's not just about individual freedom and the right to be left alone. There's also the other side of the coin, the right to health, the right to be protected by your government, protection of life, protection of physical integrity. The government, under social and economic rights, also has a duty of care to provide for medical treatment. And in my country, which by many perspectives is an affluent, rich country, in my country, the argument was made that the capacity of the intensive care departments in the hospitals was not enough, and that it was a shame that not enough money was spent on medical care in one of the richest countries of the world. Imagine what it's like in countries which have a lower standard of living and where medical supplies are even more scarce. So there is a question about how public funding is divided over the various policy aims that any government has to pursue. How much is going to the hospitals, to medical care? What about the insurance? What about unemployment benefit if you lose your job as a result of the corona crisis? Let's say the social and economic rights. Okay, this is sort of tour de table. These are rights that are affected by the corona crisis. What about the European Court of Human Rights? Of course, we have no cases from Strasbourg about the corona crisis yet. It's too early. If there will be cases, first domestic remedies will need to be exhausted, and then it will take years before the court starts delivering judgments on the corona crisis. However, there's one case that I should like to share with you. I'm also looking at my moderator because I realize that I'm running out of time. But so far he is not making gestures to me that I should stop. So I will briefly, very briefly discuss with you a Swedish case, which I think indicates the direction that the court is likely to follow if it is confronted with corona type of cases. The case of Enhorn against Sweden concerned a young man who at the time, and this is late 1990s, was infected with HIV, which led to the disease of AIDS, and who had already transmitted it to at least one other person. He was caught, let's say the authorities were aware that he was seropositive and had been sexually active and transmitting the disease. So he got instructions how to avoid spreading the disease, a number of very concrete instructions, which he didn't abide by. And then he was kept in isolation, compulsory isolation, for various periods of time. Every time he was released, he immediately returned to his old patterns of behavior and posed a threat to others, and then he was arrested again. So over a period of 7 years, he was kept in isolation for a year and a half. The court, in its analysis, said that this was a case where Article 5 of the European Convention, the right to liberty, applies, and this is a case which is anticipated by paragraph 1, sub E of Article 5, which allows for the lawful detention of persons for the prevention of the spreading of infectious diseases. And I think to the extent that people are deprived of their liberty in the current circumstances, this will be the leading case that the court will have a look at for its inspiration. And the court said detention of an individual is a serious measure. Of course, it is permitted under the Convention, Article 5, but if you go so far as to detain an individual, it must be in conformity with national law. It should be a lawful detention, and it should be necessary and proportionate. And the court then continued, there is this general principle of legal certainty, which means that the laws that allow for this detention should be very clear. They should be foreseeable, that you know under which conditions you can be detained. It should be accessible, that everybody is in a position to know what his or her rights and obligations are, and there should be no arbitrariness. Next, the authorities must convince the court that the spreading of the disease was dangerous for public health or safety. In the case of corona, I think the authorities will be able to do that. But then they must also show that the detention was the last resort to prevent the spreading of the disease because less severe measures had been found insufficient. Together, I think that these three conditions represent the three pillars of human rights law. What the court said in this case related to deprivation of liberty, so Article 5 of the Convention, but I think in any case that involves the restriction of rights under the European Convention of Human Rights, under any convention, there are the three elements that any court should look at. The legality of the measures, is there a sound legal basis to take these measures? Their legitimacy, are the measures taken for the right reason? And their necessity. And the necessity is usually broken down in three criteria. Is the measure suited to prevent the spreading of the disease? Is it something that is helpful to contain the situation? The notion of subsidiarity, were there any less severe measures available that could achieve the same result? And proportionality, if you compare the impact on the individual with the general interest that you seek to protect, is there a reasonable relationship between the two? And I think that together, these are the notions, the criteria that any court should take into account when reviewing human rights claims that have to do with corona. The whole Enhorn case was about quite an extreme situation. There was compulsory isolation, there was detention, the guy was kept in an institution, and it was clearly a case of detention. Now, the question that I have is the lockdown that we have all been subjected to, where we were told to stay at home. Is that detention or not? How should we frame this? And I thought it might be interesting to share with you an Italian case, very briefly, because time is so limited. If you want to hear more about this, either you should come to Leiden or invite me to Istanbul or any other place when travel is permitted again. This is a case from the 1990s where Mr. Guzzardi was a heavy guy. He came from Sicily, which in itself already is a region that we tend to associate with the mafia. Maybe that's wrong, maybe it's a stereotype, but still, he was convicted several times. And in 1973, he was arrested again and charged with very serious crimes. In the end, he was indeed convicted by the Milan Court of Appeal and sentenced to a very long term of imprisonment. But what the problem was in the case of Mr. Guzzardi, when he was arrested, he didn't speak to the police. He didn't give any information. He was a tough guy. He knew how to stay silent, and all his friends or conspirators or whatever, they all kept their mouth shut. And the problem was that under Italian criminal procedural law, you can only detain a person for 2 years, not longer. And within these 2 years, either you should bring him to justice, present him for a court hearing and then have a trial, or release the person. So in 1975, the authorities knew very well that Mr. Guzzardi was a bad guy who was guilty of many serious crimes, but at that time, they didn't have the necessary evidence yet. So they thought of a solution, and the solution was quite remarkable. They took him to an island off the coast of Sardinia, a small island, Asinara, and there they placed him under special supervision. And this is Asinara. Asinara is a small island, almost uninhabited. There are a few donkeys, and there is a prison. There is a prison which occupies 90% of the island to the extent that you can live there at all. The remaining 10% is a very small village in which police officers live who work in the prison, and there is a small post office, a bakery, a church, a school, and that's it. And Mr. Guzzardi was told to live there in this very tiny place on earth. He had to report to the police twice a day. He couldn't travel, he could go nowhere. But he was not detained anymore, or so the Italians argued. So this was a way to circumvent the 2-year period of detention. Now you may wonder, why do I tell you about Asinara and the donkeys if we talk about Corona? Because Mr. Guzzardi argued in the European Court of Human Rights that what happened to him was a violation of Article 5 of the Convention. He was deprived of his liberty. And the Italian government said, oh, no. You're not behind bars, you're not contained. We agree your liberty of movement is restricted, but that's not deprivation of liberty. And now you may think, oh, these lawyers, this is a play of words, but there is an important difference. Now I'll explain you the difference by quoting from the court's judgment. The court said that Article 5 is about the physical liberty of the person. Its aim is to ensure that no one should be dispossessed of the liberty in an arbitrary fashion. Article 5 is not concerned with mere restrictions on the liberty of movement. Such restrictions are governed by a different text, Article 2 of Protocol 4, which has not been ratified by Italy. And now you see the game that Italy was playing. They argued that the situation of Mr. Guzzardi was not one of Article 5, but one of this protocol, which they had not ratified and to which they were not bound. So it was only a restriction on the liberty of movement. Italy would have no problems explaining the situation in Strasbourg. There was no need to explain it. Why do I share this with you? Because today there are still 4 countries which are not a part of this protocol. And guess what? These are Greece, Switzerland, the United Kingdom, and Turkey. So for a Turkish audience, and although I can't see you, I can imagine that quite a few of you come from Turkey, this is an interesting case to reflect upon. Okay, back to the case. The court says there is no clear difference between deprivation of liberty and a restriction on the liberty of movement. It's one of degree or intensity, and not one of nature or substance. And the court then examined the situation of Mr. Guzzardi. This is a lengthy quote, but what the court said is, on the one hand, of course, you were not in a cell. You could walk around in the fresh air, you could do some exercise. So there was no physical barrier at all. On the other hand, you were only in a tiny fraction of an island. You had to report to the authorities regularly. You could not leave your dwelling. There was supervision, etc. And taking into account all these circumstances, the court said this is a situation that falls within the scope of Article 5. Now, the question that I think will be interesting to observe in the coming months or years is the various lockdown measures to which we have all been subjected. Did they amount to a mere restriction on the freedom of movement, or was it something that falls within the scope of Article 5? And it really differs. In my country, there has not been a real lockdown. It was what the government called a smart or intelligent lockdown. I could always leave my house to do shopping, to do some exercise, to walk the dog, etc., as long as I kept my distance from others. And when going to a shop, I complied with the regulations. But I could leave my house every time I wanted, as many times as I wanted. Very different in Italy, in Spain, in Greece. In Greece, if you would leave your house, you would have to report to the authorities that you would do so on your mobile phone. You would get a permission, and you would have to show the permission to any police officer when you were outside your house. So the degree of intensity differed from country to country. And I think there will be countries where arguably this lockdown amounted to deprivation of liberty, which means that Article 5 applies, which means that there should be a legal basis and all the criteria that were mentioned in the Swedish case of NR. Yeah, no opportunities for social contacts. Well, I think you may recognize that element as well. All right. I think this is about the last point on my agenda. As was mentioned in the introduction, several countries declared a state of emergency because of the corona crisis. And under Article 15 of the Convention, you can do so. Maybe before a primarily Turkish audience, I don't need to tell too much about emergency measures because the country is familiar with it. But if there is a state of emergency, the government, the state can derogate from the obligations under the convention, not the right to life, not the prohibition of slavery, but otherwise you can derogate from your obligations to the extent strictly required by the exigencies of the situation. And then you need to inform the Council of Europe if this is the situation. This has been done. I checked today. This is the last update that is available on the website of the Council of Europe. And there you see that a number of countries, Albania, Armenia, Estonia, and so on, all declared under Article 15 that they confronted a state of emergency and that they were taking certain measures that derogated from some of their obligations under the Convention. Not all Council of Europe member states did this. Turkey did not, the Netherlands did not, France did not, the UK, Germany did not, but a number of countries, primarily Western Balkan countries or countries on the eastern side of the continent, took these emergency measures. Sometimes there is no problem at all. Again, I hope that my PowerPoint can be shared with you by the organization, and then you can see, for instance, that Estonia had, I would say, a perfect derogation. They explained the situation, they explained why it was necessary to combat the spread of the coronavirus in the country in the most efficient way. They explained what they were doing, that they were closing down the schools, restricting travel, etc. And then they say this may involve a derogation of some of our obligations. These are special times which call for special measures. In the meantime, Estonia has withdrawn this declaration. The notification no longer applies. But what about Armenia? This is what I think really a controversial derogation. It's very lengthy. What I've copied here is only part of the derogation, and I want to ask your attention for Article 23 of this derogation. Armenia says the public dissemination, transfer of publications, information materials, interviews, reports on the current and new case of infection having had in the Republic of Armenia, as well as outside the Republic of Armenia and the state of health of persons, must be in conformity with official information. You must not contradict the official information and reduce it as far as possible. Now, that really is a very far-reaching limitation on the freedom of expression. I have to think of the poor Chinese doctor who wanted to alert the outside world that there was this virus, who was told not to do so. And now in Armenia, we see a repetition of just this. And I really wonder whether, if there is a case at some point before the European Court of Human Rights, whether Armenia will be argued that it was strictly necessary in the circumstances to have this very stiff ban on the freedom of expression. What else? Yes, Hungary, very briefly, Mr. Orban used the coronavirus to seize more power. He did not officially notify the Council of Europe that he was declaring a state of emergency, but he did take a number of measures. Internally, he did invoke the state of emergency. He was quite quick in imposing a ban on travel from a number of countries, prohibit indoor gatherings. And then in April, he proposed a law which was adopted and then later withdrawn, but which allowed for an indefinite extension of the state of emergency. And if you would be found guilty as a journalist of spreading distorted truth or breaking isolation orders, you could go to prison for 5 years. And the Prime Minister also got the power to suspend any existing laws and create new ones. Here, Parliament was really surrendering to the Prime Minister. And then during this whole episode, the Hungarian government seized the opportunity to introduce a number of other measures, which in a strict sense have nothing to do with the corona crisis, with the exception that the corona crisis was used to implement these measures. And one is the subject of quite a tough campaign at the time being, the so-called Section 33, which limits the rights of transsexuals or intersex persons. They can no longer change the identification of their sex in their identity documents. Now, that of course caused quite a row. Here you see a statement by a number of countries about, in a way, Hungary. It is legitimate, these countries say, that member states adopt extraordinary measures to protect their citizens and overcome the crisis. We are, however, deeply concerned about the risk of violations of the principles of the rule of law, democracy and fundamental rights arising from the adoption of certain emergency measures. Two things are interesting about this declaration, apart from the fact that, of course, one can fully agree with this. One thing that's interesting is the declaration is about Hungary, but Hungary is not mentioned, which created the possibility for the Hungarian government one day later to say, oh, this is actually a wonderful statement, we join it, we fully agree. So the other member states were caught with their pants down, they had failed to mention Hungary, and now Hungary joined them and said, this is not about us. The other thing which is so interesting is member states. It refers to member states of the European Union and not of the Council of Europe. The EU in the last couple of months and maybe years has become a dominant actor when it comes to the protection of human rights in Europe, which of course is not very helpful to those states who are not or not yet EU member states. But also if you look at the response of European Parliament to the whole crisis, it is European Parliament, an EU institution, which is very visible in the whole situation, like the European Commission. And interestingly, European Parliament asked the EU to impose sanctions and stop payments because Hungary was violating the rule of law and democratic rights. Now, I think I should leave it at this. I hope that I managed to convey, in a way, the richness of the topic. It may also leave you with a sense of helplessness because there is so much to discuss, where to begin and how to have an in-depth discussion. But at least I hope to have shown you that we have a very fascinating and rich topic, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Rick.
Thank you.
Thank you for the terrific remarks. I see that you triggered many questions, in fact. Before moving on to the questions, I would like to remind to the members of the audience that we not only welcome questions, but if you would like to contribute to the discussion with your own comments, observations, views, you are welcome to post them in the Q&A or chat function on Zoom. So let me start with the first question. It's about fair trial rights. They're asking your evaluations about online tools to conduct hearings and your evaluation under fair trial rights. To my knowledge, European Court of Human Rights held its first online hearing recently, and will there be any fair trial indications there?
Thank you. Yeah, I recall actually being at a conference in Istanbul a couple of years ago, which was, if I remember correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it was about the introduction of courts of appeal in Turkey, where at the time, if I recall correctly, there were 5 of them, and Turkey being such a big country, the question was if a suspect who has been convicted at first instance after hearing, if he appeals or if the prosecution service appeals and the Court of Appeal starts to deal with the case, should there be another hearing or can this be online? And online would be more convenient because of distance, etc. I spoke to a Dutch judge really yesterday, and I asked him about his experience with online hearings. And the argument is often made that a judge in a criminal case should see the person in front of him so as to form an opinion on the reliability of the person and what kind of person he is. You can only establish guilt or innocence if you talk face to face with the person. According to this judge, who serves in the Court of Appeal in The Hague, he said maybe that's not so much the problem. You can if the camera is good, if the connection is good, I think you can communicate pretty well with the suspect and his lawyer, but it becomes problematic if more parties join the hearing. If there is a translator as well, if there is an injured party, if they all have lawyers, if there are experts, etc., and then you sort of lose oversight. So he felt uneasy with the online hearings, not so much in a one-to-one situation. And there are certain procedures whereby fairly straightforward questions are asked and then only one party is involved. And then it's a practical tool. But as soon as things become complicated, his strong preference was to have face-to-face hearings. The difficulty, of course, is that if you have to postpone these hearings over a long period of 3 months, it means that you are delaying justice. And by the time that you resume hearings, you have this huge reservoir of cases that you still need to hear. So it may also lead to problems of undue delays and then the right to a fair trial within reasonable time. So it's a difficult dilemma.
Another question is limitations on freedom of movement and its impact on asylum seekers.
I apologize because I should have mentioned in my tour d'horizon, I should have mentioned the horrible situation of many asylum seekers in Europe, on the Greek islands and in other places where even before the crisis, the corona crisis started, already reception facilities quite often were very poor, substandard, not providing enough protection to vulnerable people. And not just in Greece, also France was convicted by the European Court of Human Rights last week for offering reception facilities which were too low, or actually for not offering reception facilities to a certain group. That's France. And this has only become worse with the corona crisis. I think in these camps where people are living very close to one another, where medical facilities are minimal, where resources are lacking, where living conditions are horrible, it is a big shame, and it's only getting worse with the corona crisis, for sure.
Okay, thank you.
What can I say? I should have mentioned this from the beginning, yes.
Okay, there's partly a theoretical question in here. It says that you dealt with the term tolerance as a core human rights value, and the question says that we should not only tolerate each other, but we should find ways to respect each other. So we should go a bit further than tolerating each other.
Nice. Yeah. How could I disagree? The words tolerance, pluralism, tolerance, and broad-mindedness come from a judgment of the European Court of Human Rights, well-known judgment, handy side against the United Kingdom, 1970s, where the court said the freedom of expression protects not only statements that are received with enthusiasm, but also offensive or shocking or disturbing statements. Such are the demands of pluralism, tolerance, and broad-mindedness, without which there is no democratic society. That's handyside, and it has always been a phrase that I have in the back of my mind when thinking about human rights. Now, how do we define tolerance? Is tolerance merely accepting the existence of others and deciding not to kill them on the spot? Or is tolerance a richer notion whereby you also cherish and celebrate diversity and are happy with the richness of human life and can live with the fact that other people are different and diverse? If the commentator believes that we should have this richer notion of tolerance and move to respect, who would I be to disagree? I would respect this. I would not only tolerate this view, but I would also respect it.
Okay. Another question is about freedom of expression of doctors. It says that it has been partly a problem in Turkey, but it was maybe still is a big problem in Russia. So has there been any cases of that kind in Central Europe, is the question?
Central Europe, I don't know. I like to believe that I live in the western part of Europe. Actually, we had a very interesting situation in this country. Initially, when the first lockdown measures were introduced, the government, the authorities, did not intend to close down schools. The medical information that was available at the time suggested that children are not so likely to be infected, nor can they pass on the coronavirus easily. So there was no objective medical reason the authorities believed on the basis of medical expertise and advice, there was no reason to close down the schools. Then in society, parents, not all parents of course, but some parents became wary and thought, is it safe to send my children to school if shops are closing down, etc. And then in a weekend there was a conference of medical doctors, and it was about the crisis and what people knew. This was mid-March, how much information was available, and then two doctors in the discussion asked a question whether it would not be advisable to close the schools. And somehow at the end of the meeting, a press release was issued by this organization. We had an online conference, and this was one of the issues that was discussed. And immediately this element was picked up by newspapers and by trade unions of teachers who said, there you go, now the doctors also say that we should close down the schools. And on Monday, the schools were closed. So in days like these, where we are confronted with new phenomena that we really don't control and do not really understand, it is very important what doctors say. Their statements carry a lot of weight. And this means that the doctors, because they have so much weight now on their shoulders, should act responsibly, should not make any statements that are not based on evidence, but that can create quite a shock. At the same time, my Chinese hero, Dr. Li Wenliang, if only his freedom of expression had been protected and had been guaranteed, then the world would have been a much better place. So yes, doctors do have the freedom of expression, of course, like all human beings. Because of their position in this crisis, they should be careful with what they say. They have a responsibility, but I would say it is their responsibility, and it's not the function of the ordinary authorities who are not medical specialists to tell the doctors what to think or what to say.
Okay, thank you. Well, another question asks your comments about an anti-COVID vaccine, if and when that vaccine is available, whether it could be compulsory under human rights law.
I see you laughing. I think you're happy that I get all these questions. You can make an argument that one cannot be compelled to have a vaccine if, because of your religion, you believe that it is in the hands of God whether you fall ill or not, or whether you will live or die, and it's not for man to interfere with that. There are those in my country and in other countries. Then you can derive from the freedom of religion or freedom of conscience, and also the right to physical integrity, you can derive an argument that you are not compelled to have a vaccine. At the same time, the costs for society and for others of that choice may be considerable. If the parents of a child decide not to have a vaccine for the child and they send the child to school, that child may pose a risk to my children and to the teachers. So it may lead to sickness, which may lead to medical costs. And then the question is, who should bear the medical costs if these were avoidable because somebody could have taken medicine and a vaccination? So one way out of this dilemma might be to say, well, it is your choice. If you don't want to have a vaccine, it is your right, and I cannot, this is not the Middle Ages, I cannot grab you and pinch you with a needle and force you to have the vaccine. We don't do that, but you must bear the consequences, which means that you cannot rely on health insurance if you fall ill. If we have a limited number of intensive care units and you are in need of intensive care, you will be the last in line, because those who took the vaccine and fell ill anyhow, maybe because of another illness, will take priority. And maybe this would be a way out, that you allow people to follow their choice, but also tell them that they should suffer the consequence of their choice.
Another question goes as the following. it says that states can limit human rights due to pandemic, but at which stage a derogation notice from a human rights treaty is required?
Yeah. Another wonderful question. When do restrictions end and when do you need a derogation? We have 47 Council of Europe member states, and as you have seen in the slide, about 12 or 13 have decided to invoke Article 15 of the Convention and introduce the possibility of derogations, and the remaining 30-something decided not to do so. Who is right and who is wrong? Assuming that the countries are confronted with the same crisis, that the corona crisis is about as serious in all these countries, it's a sort of laboratory that we now have. This is an experiment. We have 47 identical cases, and we treat 13 with Article 15, and the other 35 we don't treat with Article 15. And then, as a good scientist, we check what happens in the laboratory. I think that in my country, the government has made following calculation or analysis. As long as we can handle the current crisis within the ordinary framework of limitations, there is no need to invoke Article 15 and derogation measures, and actually it might lead to a lowering of the standards that we as a government do not want to lower. So we would rather stick to the original framework, believing that there is enough latitude in the convention to take reasonable measures. And I think that by and large, the convention allows for sufficient flexibility. The case of Enhorn is an example, a Swedish case that I mentioned. The court did not find a violation of Article 5, and I think that most of the measures taken are perfectly reasonable to protect public health. But there are problems. For instance, it has taken quite a while for my country to adopt formal crisis legislation aiming at countering the coronavirus. In the initial weeks and months of the crisis, emergency regulations and decrees were used, which were provided for by law, but the common understanding has been these should be temporary measures. And there comes a point in time, maybe after 2 months or after 3 months, that you can no longer use these interim measures, and you should have a decent law also to involve Parliament in the decision-making procedure. And until today, that law has not been passed. It is now pending before Parliament. But you could perhaps argue that, for instance, the restrictions on the freedom of religion, whereby no public services could be held in churches and mosques, under Dutch legislation, you need a legal basis for these restrictions. We do not have a basis in the written enactments of Parliament, and they're only in these emergency decrees. Now, you can get away with it for a couple of weeks and months, but after a while, it becomes more doubtful, and then you have a problem under the European Convention, unless you invoke Article 15. So my answer is, this is not rocket science. We do not know how far you can go in responding to the crisis without Article 15. But I would say if the national legislation is in order, if the laws are accessible, foreseeable, clear, do not allow for arbitrariness, then the problem will not be in Strasbourg, and there is no need to invoke Article 15.
Okay, thank you. The next question is about government's attempt to reduce misinformation on press. So the question goes as the following: does it contradict with freedom of expression?
Yeah, this goes back to the example of Armenia, where the government very clearly said, whatever you write about the corona crisis should not contradict our policies, it should not question our data, nothing at all. I think this goes way too far. It prevents any debate on the situation, and it's counterproductive. It will not help the government in making better policies. It will make people distrust everything they read because there is this obligation not to report freely. Same in Hungary. Journalists will be scared to death by the prospect of a 5 years imprisonment. So the chilling effect is huge. And I think that these are all clear examples of a violation of the freedom of expression. And if there is fake news, that is serious, but I think in principle, the reply should be one of substance, one of explaining, and hoping that you can reach people with reliable information and convince them with reliable information.
Okay. The next question is about European Court of Human Rights. It says that during the pandemic, judges at the European Court of Human Rights elected a new president. That's Robert Spano, who has in recent years focused on the principle of subsidiarity in his publications and became a new president now. So it seems there's a great deal of expectations from his presidency in the human rights circles as well as in his own court. So would you like to comment on that move at the court?
I don't know whether he's watching, but if he is, Judge Spano, congratulations. I have never had the privilege of deliberating with him in chambers about a judgment of the European Court of Human Rights. I don't know what it's like to work with him, but I have met him once or twice. We once shared an elevator ride to the 6th floor of the Human Rights Palace, and he kindly introduced himself. He looks like a nice guy. I think, like many people watching the court, I'm impressed by his separate opinions when he writes them. One of the things where I think he really did a great job, there is an important case pending before the European Court from his country, Iceland. Despite his Italian name, he is from Iceland. And I assume that he played a role in a very quick way in which the court dealt with this case, Astradsson against Iceland, which is about the independence of judiciary, important topic in many countries. The case is now pending before the Grand Chamber very quickly after a judgment was delivered. And I think that he senses that the court should be very quick and decisive when there are important questions on the menu, and that the court should prioritize its scarce resources to the most important and present issues. So I'm full of expectations, of course, but then his predecessor, Linas Sicilianos, was also an excellent judge and scholar, and so were his predecessors, Jean-Paul Costa, Nick Brazza, they were all excellent. And even in the 1980s, there was a Dutch judge who nowadays nobody remembers, but we thought that he was really an excellent judge. So they have a great tradition of electing their presidents.
Okay, we have just four more minutes left. I just reserved a couple of minutes for my own question.
Oh no.
Well, it seems the Dutch government has been preparing very well during the pandemic. They declared last week that they are filing a case, an interstate case, against Russia due to downing of the MH17, the Malaysian Airlines flight, in eastern Ukraine in 2014. And this Friday is the 6th anniversary of the event. So I'm looking forward for your comments about this interstate case, which is quite rare in the European human rights system, right?
Yes, you're very well informed, Olgun. Interstate cases are very rare. What we have had is just a handful of cases, and quite often they were between countries with very poor diplomatic relations. Georgia has filed a number of complaints against Russia, so did Ukraine. Ireland did in the past against the United Kingdom in respect to the conflict in Northern Ireland. There have been very few cases, actually only two, where, and they happen to involve both our countries, where states brought a complaint where they had no direct interest other than a concern for the overall protection of human rights in Europe. And I think this is something to be regretted, that states were hesitant to use the interstate complaint procedure, because the longer you wait, the higher the threshold becomes to actually use it. And if then one day you use it, it is immediately a big thing. And I really regret this. It would have been much better if it was part of the more or less daily interaction between states, if they have different views on how things are going, that they present a question to the court without this appearing to be a very hostile act. What I hope is that the impact on the diplomatic relations between my country and Russia will not be that bad. The downing of the MH17 was a very serious incident. I must add, it is an incident that took place in a war where many more people died. It just happened to be the case that a fairly large number of Dutch citizens were in this airplane. So we feel connected to this incident, although it was a Malaysian airplane that crashed, but there were many Dutch victims. On the other hand, if there were 200 Dutch victims, and I regret their death, there were thousands of victims in the eastern part of the Ukraine, and we don't say so much about them. So this makes me feel a bit uneasy. The conflict is much larger than just this airplane. I wished that states would have recourse to the in-state complaints procedure more often. They have a common responsibility to protect human rights in Europe, and this is one of the instruments they have at their disposal. The other remark that no doubt Russia will make is perhaps the following. It is interesting that there is a criminal case about the downing of the MH17 pending in the Netherlands before a criminal court. There are 4 people indicted. They are accused of involvement in this downing, but the case is still pending. The Dutch courts didn't arrive at any conclusion yet whether the suspects are innocent or guilty, to what extent, all this we do not know. And then maybe the Russian government is going to say it's rather quick of the Dutch government to skip all that and now to bring a complaint against Russia as if they already know where the suspect was. Having said that, I don't know what exactly the contents of the complaint is, what the reproach is that the Dutch government makes. If it is just a lack of cooperation with the criminal proceedings, then it is different from attributing responsibility for the actual downing of the airplane. This we don't know.
Okay, thank you. So we came to an end. It has been a rich conversation. Yeah, we had a lot of materials to think about further. Thank you, Rick, for being with us today. Thank you, FNF program officers, Elif Güney and Laura Kunzendorf were working behind the scene. Thank you, our translators. And thank you to the audience for sticking with us for 1.5 hours. We hope to see the many members of the audience again for future events. So stay in touch, stay safe, and help others to stay safe. Have a good afternoon.